U.S. Department of Agriculture said this week after 3 years of falling, it expects a slight uptick in net farm income for 2017. The agency's second of 3 yearly releases showed net farm income at $63.4 billion, a 3% increase from 2016, but still nearly half of 2013's record. The August forecast projects receipts from soybeans will be 6% higher than 2016, but puts those from corn lower for the fifth straight year. Its outlook on receipts from livestock shows a 6% climb in cattle and calves and a 15% jump in hogs. Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business Inc. joined us after the estimates were released Wednesday. We began by asking if the small reversal in the overall number indicates the industry has hit a bottom.
I think that's a hard thing to say because we have such a cyclical nature to the industry. So, I mean, still an early freeze could completely change these forecasts. So it's a hard thing to say, but things seem to have settled in both cost and income to the point where at least we can learn to manage in this new era.
So before we look at these numbers, I want to go back to when we talked in May, and you had seen an increase in net farm income in 2016 from 2015 levels, which was a huge surprise. So with these numbers in mind, do you see anything that has stuck out to characteristics that lead you to think why that happened more clearly than maybe the last time we spoke?
So, as we dig into that, there's a little bit of a couple things. Certainly, like the beef finishing enterprise had a bad year again in 16, but not near as bad as 15. So that we saw some increase there. But really, when we separate those crop operations off, they really had a much better year in 16 than they did in 15. And I think a lot of it was really making some adjustments. So we started to see some, continued tweaking down in those cost of production numbers per acre, kind of across the board, everything just kind of fine tuning its way down. And really, sometimes a couple dollars an acre doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really starts to make a difference when you're making 3 or 4 of those adjustments.
What does the USDA see for 2017 in crops and livestock?
So, we're looking, they're projecting really kind of break even. I think they said maybe 3% increase. But, I think we'll see that better, at least up to this point. That beef industry, again, continues to look better. Hog numbers a little bit better. And maybe crops maybe a little more steady. And I think we'll probably see that within our numbers as well.
What does USDA indicate about debt numbers? Anything that you find noteworthy?
And it's just interesting that their debt numbers are mirroring what we see in our numbers, with basically a pretty steady incline in the amount of debt that each operation is carrying since about 2003, 2004. It's fine, and from a debt to asset standpoint, we're still sitting good. So that total debt isn't totally alarming, but we're still dealing with a lot more debt. And at least in our data, we're not looking at larger acre sizes. So more debt per acre, it just means more risk.
Their debt to asset ratio is 12.7%. Now, if somebody has heard you speak, they might see a larger number than that. Can you explain why that is?
Well, I think when you're looking at benchmarking your operation to any numbers, it's really important to understand how that calculation is made. And it takes some digging into that. But my first instinct was we don't use the highest and best use for land values, for a couple of reasons. We want to be kind of conservative and not having to pull that down one day. I also don't build in a deferred tax liability that if you were to sell ground for, there's pretty good liability associated with that. So we keep those land values lower for both of those purposes. If USDA is looking at that highest and best use number, it's going to bring debt to asset down. But we also need to be aware that if the land values start to drop, then that debt to asset will rise more rapidly on their numbers. So again, when you're benchmarking, it's just really important that you dig into how those numbers are generated so that if you're comparing apples and apples or something different.
Where's your rate at, and what rate would be concerning?
Well, so our average is at 28%. We use a 30% as what we would say trigger that yellow light caution area. So not too bad. We're sitting in a good position, and that yellow range would go up to 60. So, and maybe even 70. For some lending institutions would have some different numbers, but.
What does the USDA indicate for direct farm program payments?
It looks to me like they're projecting about the same. And so the good news is maybe from a cash flow standpoint for your operation that we can at least look at what we got last year and say, okay, let's plug that in, because there's still a lot to go in calculating those numbers. But it's maybe a pretty good estimation in what we're going to look for cash flow.
With all these things in mind and the current overview of crop and soybean markets, as we look at that September 1st deadline for handshake leases, what do you want producers to keep in mind about cash rents and land prices?
It's a tough thing, and I think depending again on what happened to your leases during the good years, for those that went up rapidly, we really need to do some good education with our landlords and educating them as to what the profitability is on their farm. And sometimes that's hard if you don't have the records, but maybe we need it's a good reason to sit down and start throwing some of those things together. And then it's never bad to have things in writing, no matter how long you've been renting from a producer, because you may make an agreement to reduce, and they may quickly find somebody else who's willing to keep it where they were last year, and without that written lease, you're out. And so even though it maybe seems like an awkward conversation for somebody that you've dealt with on that for a long time, maybe is a good time to start looking at that.